Thank you for the silence and attention. I don't get that from my kids. Welcome back. Hope you had a great lunch. We're gonna move on for the afternoon. We have another panel before we get into more of a roundtable type of discussion. We have one more panel here. This panel is Species Conservation and Endangered Species Act Government and Quasi-Governmental Entities panel. We're going to have three panelists here that will highlight innovative species conservation efforts and share their perspectives on how the Endangered Species Act is influencing work in the public sector. We'll start with Joel Bousman, the County Commissioner from Sublette County, and followed by John Harja, Senior Policy Analyst from Utah's Public Lands Policy Coordination Office. And then we'll have Jackie Buchanan, who's the Deputy Regional Forester for the United States Forest Service, for the Rocky region. Commissioner.
Thank you, David. I want to thank Governor Meade and Western governors for taking on this important topic and for the invitation to address you here today. My name is Joel Bousman. I'm a rancher and county commissioner in Sublette County, Wyoming, Western Wyoming. I also serve as the second vice president for the National Association of Counties, Western Interstate Region. Earlier today, my colleague, Commissioner Lee Livingston from here in Park County, talked a little bit about the importance of engaging state officials in the ESA process. Commissioner Livingston rightly pointed out that Wyoming's Game and Fish Department has qualified people and can be trusted to manage the wildlife in Wyoming. However, I want to expand on that point a little more to talk about the role local government, particularly county government, can play in effective wildlife management and in improving the outcomes of the ESA. Often when we think about species conservation in the ESA, we tend to think about the federal government's relationship to the states. However, it is important to understand that Fish and Wildlife Service also has an obligation to consult with and receive input from counties affected by petition listings and regulations that are written as a result of those listings. Section 1533B of the ESA twice lists counties as necessary partners in the process. First, when deciding upon whether a species is threatened or endangered, the Fish and Wildlife Service must take into account the conservation efforts not only of the state, but also of the state's political subdivisions. Later in the same section, the Fish and Wildlife Service is required to give actual notice of any new regulation or designation to counties and invite comment from counties about those regulations. Despite that plain language, I am concerned that too often the federal government either ignores its obligation to counties or acknowledges counties only as a check-the-box exercise. I think if we're honest, we probably have to acknowledge the language of the ESA lets the Fish and Wildlife Service mostly off the hook on any coordination with counties. This is a flaw with the ESA that should be rectified if we want a law that leads to successful conservation and actual recovery. The National Association of Counties has a section on improving the ESA in its platform. Inclusion in NACO's platform means that that issue is a consistent and important issue for every county in the nation, not just here in the West. The NACO platform acknowledges that the ESA is a critically important law, but it goes on to say, and I quote, NACO supports reforming the ESA to mandate that the federal government treat state and county governments as cooperating agencies with full rights of coordination, consultation, and consistency to decide jointly with the appropriate federal agencies when and how to list species, designate habitat, and plan and manage for species recovery and delisting. The Fish and Wildlife Service proposed rule on listing petitions was a good first step as it included the requirement that states be given the opportunity to comment on species petitions. Our state association, the Wyoming County Commissioners Association, asked in our written comments that counties also be included in this process. But why do we want this? And what is it that counties have to offer that others do not when it comes to EA petitions, regulations, or changes in status? Probably the most obvious answer to the question of why we want this authority is that we have found that here in Wyoming, the most successful BLM and Forest Service management plans on any topic have been the ones that were developed collaboratively with local governments. Litman's requirements of coordination and CEQ's cooperating agency process, while not silver bullets, they do provide the framework and the flexibility for local governments and the federal agencies to at least attempt a collaborative approach. As it is currently written, the ESA does not adequately promote and certainly does not require that kind of collaboration with local government. What we have to offer in this process is first and foremost a broad view on the necessity, pitfalls, and effects on our counties as a result of ESA listings. Federal and even state agencies can sometimes be hindered by the narrow focus of their particular agency mission. By contrast, the county commissioner, by nature of the charge of the office, must take into account the health and welfare of their entire county, its people, land, water, and wildlife. This broad view means that we have more on-the-ground specific knowledge of wildlife in our counties and how management decisions might have ripple effects. We also serve as a bridge between the federal agencies and the people living in our counties, but maybe most importantly, we often find ourselves as a bridge between the federal agencies themselves. Since by necessity we work with every agency, sometimes finding ourselves trapped between two agencies with different missions, it is often the case that we end up the messenger between them. This very scenario played out recently in an issue dealing with potential take of grizzly bears in the Richard Teton National Forest in Southern County. Grazing permittees found themselves in a very difficult position as grizzly takes were approaching their limit. It took the county bringing together the Forest Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service with help from our governor to reach at least an appropriate short-term resolution. In the cooperating agency process I already mentioned, commissioners are recognized as having specific expertise on the socioeconomic status of the county and the possible socioeconomic impacts for federal actions. The NACO platform calls for that authority in the ESA process as well, and I agree. Developing socioeconomic data that is usable and accurate is a difficult and expensive undertaking. Many counties struggle to ensure this data is kept up to date. In the federal land use decision-making process, counties at least have the assurance that well-maintained data will be used as part of the process. But this is not true for the ESA, which is why the second part of NACO's platform calls for cumulative and quantitative economic analysis of proposed regulations and their impact on all stakeholders, both public and private. There may have been a time in America's past when inflexible laws were necessary to overcome cultural apathy towards conservation. As Wyoming's representative Cynthia Lummis has often spoken about, America's conservation laws have not kept up with the new cultural conservation ethic. Representative Lummis calls it our 21st century conservation ethic, allowing for greater local input, understanding the custom and culture of the local community, and an honest assessment of socioeconomic impacts is not a threat to species viability, but can rather be a help in creating regulations when necessary that can be embraced at the local level. The best decisions are always made by local people working collaboratively with state and federal agency personnel at the ground level. And I've been working in that capacity for many years and with many federal agency people that are here in this room right now. The Endangered Species Act, unfortunately, is a law deeply rooted in the 20th century model of top-down mandates. The ESA should be a mechanism that provides support and resources to the states and to the local governments. I'm hopeful that one outcome of these forums will be that the WGA is a recognition that the ESA can and should work better for species and people, and that one way to do that is more inclusion of local knowledge. Thank you, and I look forward to further discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. Also, like to thank WGA for hosting this. It's been my privilege for 25 years now to work with WGA on a lot of issues. Some of it has been really, really helpful, like our critical habitat assessment tool, which is something I'd like to point you toward. WGA helped us get going. The states got together, all the Western states, and put together a tool that talks about critical habitat and what it means. Today you'll find that data at the Walkthrough webpage, and it represents to us a path to show to the world that the states actually can get together and sort out these issues without interference from Washington, which is one of my key points here. The Public Lands Office is part of the Governor's Office of the state of Utah. And it was put together a long time ago in the mid-'80s by then Governor Matheson, a rare Democrat in Utah. And his view was, frankly, the federal agencies are picking and choosing what they want to hear from state agencies and ignoring the rest. And so we need to speak with one voice. And we've been doing that since. And it's been very helpful, very positive that the state speaks with one voice. However, we do get criticisms from our federal colleagues for that very reason. They think we're interfering and not allowing agencies to speak. So the difference is speaking with one voice about facts, science, hypotheses, and speaking with one voice about policies, which is a whole different question entirely in solutions. And the governor certainly supports a lot of positive solutions, and we have many. However, one of the issues we find is, of course, that agencies, federal agencies, tend to be stuck in analysis, paralysis by analysis. We just finished a lot of BLM plans in 2008, and immediately we're redoing them. We cannot ever seem to reach conclusion on anything related to decisions on the ESA or even BLM Forest Service planning, which is something Governor Meade mentioned this morning. Utah spends a lot of time proactively working on ESA issues. Almost everything proposed in Utah has some connection to an ESA, a plant, an animal. Some of them are big, like prairie dogs, and not big wolves, I suppose, physically, but they're big, they're listed, and nobody's doing anything about it. They're overrunning the place. They're everywhere. You can go out and count them. You can see them. Sometimes in the summer, you see a field, and you can see hundreds of them out there. And yet the service is incapable of concluding a recovery plan. This is out of control. Why not? Let's fix one. Let's figure out how to count these critters, determine if there's enough of them, and move on toward delisting. Yet we're stuck because they only count the critters on federal lands. Why? There's something wrong here, frankly. So we spend a lot of time to get some positive results. We have agreements that have prevented listings. The least chub, little fish that lives out in these isolated ponds in the Great Basin. Recently, we had the Graham's Fen Salmon that was mentioned this morning. Spent a lot of time working on a solution, conservation agreement involved private property, state people, county officials, the service, reached a reasonable conclusion involving areas of refugia. And of course, it's being litigated now, and we'll defend it. But part of the problem we found is a lack of understanding on the services part of science. I'm not talking biology, I'm talking mining, and how mining works, and the economics of mining. Nobody pays attention to that. And when we bring it up, they look at us with disdain. I emphasize with disdain and say, we don't have to pay attention to that. Well, that may be in a listing decision, but when we're talking about whether there's actually a threat caused by mining to this particular plant, it is part of the equation and they ignore it. That's the problem. They need the service, and everybody else, somebody needs to figure out how to include proper mining engineering, petroleum engineering, recreational design features. We have recreational facilities being challenged. And so they understand better the nature of threats when they're considering listing. We have a lot of very positive efforts. We have what we call the Watershed Restoration Initiative in Utah. It's been going on for 2 decades now. It was put together as a cooperative venture between the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, the state, and local government. And it is a huge success story. It's going on today. So sometimes we like to point to bad things, but there are a lot of good things here too. This is a huge one. And what we do out in the Great Basin and other places is improvement projects, mostly involving removal of PJ. In the West Desert, when you remove PJ, you get more water. You can watch the water table rise. You can watch fields that are dry become desert. And you can watch the insects that little critters like sage-grouse love to eat, stuff like flourishing. So it's a very positive thing. In fact, that program fit well into our sage-grouse plan that was unfortunately ultimately rejected by the Fish and Wildlife Service. But those are there. Those will continue. They're very positive. We have another group called the Utah Partners for Conservation Development. They get along. They get together and they focus how to make ranching work out there, how to make mining work, how to still conserve the species, and most importantly, try to find a place for industry to get the credits for what it's doing, and it starts to fit into safe harbor agreements and all that as well. However, there are a number of frustrations. One of those being this attitude that everything has to be identical across state lines. That's a very nice attitude. It sounds like it makes sense, and the birds fly across the state lines, the animals walk across. Mice don't, but everything else is. And it fails to recognize the political realities of getting things done. It's the positive side of human interactions. This is essential. And to get things done in Wyoming is different than Idaho, and it's different than Utah, it's different than Nevada, it's different than those states on the West Coast. Those guys over there. In Utah, I mentioned this to the service many times. They mentioned quite bluntly, we have a constitutional takings issue. We cannot take private property without compensation. The federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, basically gets a skate on that. The Supreme Court has allowed them some freedom, but we can't do that. And so to solve constitutional issues and get people to buy into conservation is voluntary. They want to agree to it. Stewards of the land want to agree to it, but when we use that word voluntary because they're not being forced to be voluntary, the service has a problem. And so with sage-grouse, for example, we were told in 2011 to put a plan together, but we were counting on the NRCS, I see Tim sitting over there, to help us with all of these agreements. We put millions of dollars into conservation agreements, but you don't get those things overnight. They're expensive, they take time. And you gotta have the time to put together a program to show a positive sense of results, because easements are contracts and they count as regulatory mechanisms, but you have to have them in place. Well, that takes time. And if the service puts together an artificial deadline, say September 30th, 2015 on a particular species, they don't give you enough time, and then they tell you that you don't have enough time to get it done, and therefore you have an incorrect and inadequate regulatory mechanism. They basically bluntly lied to us from the very beginning, because we didn't have enough time, yet they encouraged us to go forward. So the idea of putting together a better system of regulatory mechanisms involving conservation easements, whatever you want to call it, SGI work, has got to come into play. We had an issue, Mr. Fraser this morning mentioned the tiger beetle. It lives in sand dunes down in some deep sand, reddish colored sand down in southern Utah. And OHVs that like to go play on the dunes, it's wide open dunes, apparently causes some trouble with the dude. We had an agreement, we had a conservation agreement that was working, and suddenly the service decided they needed more land off limits to OHVs. Well, okay, incrementally they take more, they take more, they take more. Pretty soon, this last round, we said that park is going to have to shut down because we can no longer provide the services that people will pay for to come and play there with their OHVs. So it's a small economic impact. It's a state park that's closing into the world, but it does show what happens. So the tiger beetle is an example to us of what do you really need, what is the real need for the species, and are you willing to go that far? We said we're just going to have to shut down this park. And the service is perfectly capable of doing that if they want to. They don't care, frankly. But it does show that even recreation can be impacted. In Utah, we're constantly told the future is recreation, outdoor recreation. What they don't mean is motorized outdoor recreation. What they mean is backpackers and skiers and such like that. And so this kind of park where you can go play is not that relevant. I'm hoping somebody's watching my home. So one of the things I'd like to discuss briefly is sort of the dark side of the sage-grouse decision. Because from our perspective in Utah, and maybe I can speak for themselves in some other areas, although the proper conclusion was reached in the sense of not warranted, the cost is too high. The cost was simply too much. And what I'd like to point out is what happened, frankly, is somebody mentioned this morning, we ought to trust to work on these things. I agree. We have the trust of the local people. We have the trust of the state office. And our friends in DEC decided to make a decision that we're inadequate and we need something else. And they posed it from above on us. And we ended up with something that we would argue not only is overkill in certain areas in terms of protections, but those protections aren't solving the problems that sage-grouse need in Utah. I'm pleased as punch in Wyoming is working. My friend Bob Budbacker put together a great program in Wyoming, but that program wasn't going to work in Utah. We have a different ecological situation. The state line does matter. We have a different set of solutions, and we got ignored because it didn't meet what they wanted. All right, fair enough. But don't be surprised if we challenge it, and don't be surprised if we look for more time. Because what is needed to solve sage-grouse and encourage conservation in Utah is not regulation. Science has shown that in Utah, you need to give them more space. They are limited in space. They're very isolated populations. They need more space in order to grow. And we can give that to them. But that's not in the BLM plan. It's not in the Forest Service plan. They instead picked on other things. So the very thing that we need, fire protection from wildfire, the ability to create more space, largely through SGI projects, largely through our own WRI projects, was not given any credit. So they're not solving the problem of increased conservation for the species. And that's unfortunate. We're going to continue to do it. In 5 years, we'll see where we are. But I think that we need to back up and make sure that science is followed. Not random science, not GIS science, but actual science involving counts of birds and things that are happening on the ground. You know, the error bound on an average count is 0. The error bound in some of these studies that were enforced on us, like 3% disturbance gaps, is much larger than that. So what are we really talking about in terms of science? He's waving at me, so thank you very much.
Okay, so good afternoon. I'll do a confession right up front. Just so you know, in my mind, I think I'm 6 foot tall. And then I stand behind the podium and I realize I'm stretching it at 5'2". So that's my confession for the day. Let's see. So I am Jackie Buchanan, U.S. Forest Service currently, and recently became the Deputy Regional Forester for the Rocky Mountain region. Prior to that, I was the Director of Renewable Resources with responsibility in the Rocky Mountain region for range, timber, wildlife, air quality, water quality, basically all of the resource areas. Prior to that, I was Forest Supervisor on the River Teton, so I had some very direct and real experience here in Wyoming dealing with a lot of the species that you've heard about today. And then I was also a Forest Supervisor down in New Mexico. Started my career with Forest Service down there, so fairly widespread, at least across those 3 states with experience. And I want to thank the Western Government Association for letting me be a part of this day, because I do think this is a super important and very exciting initiative, given all the things that have been brought up so far. I mean, sage-grouse, we've heard that loud and clear, and I think however you feel about the outcome, it's one of the most significant undertakings we've had across all the agencies and in partnership with all the states. So I think this will carry a piece of that forward, and it's going to be very interesting to see how this goes forward. So what I'm going to do is I've got about 15 slides. Talk a little bit up front about ESA and how that relates to the Forest Service, how we have to work with within that, under that. And then a little bit about, from a Rocky Mountain region perspective, what does that mean to us? And when I speak to the impacts or the challenges that we have, that will be laid out, I think, in the last couple slides. So for me, as a land manager responsible for overseeing public lands, my view is it's always a balancing act. We don't have, part of me thinks, wouldn't it be great if they just gave you, your priority list, and you're going to manage for 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is, and wouldn't that be easy? But we all know that that would not be the right answer, and that would not be best for what's out there. So it's a balancing act. We, in cooperation, in partnership with a whole lot of other folks, because these are public lands, looking at how we can manage it, considering all the activities that are taking place out there. So in particular, with the Endangered Species Act, a couple of things, I think, that we need to talk about. For the first one, let's look, and you're going to see a bit more information on the slides, but I'm going to zero in on a few points. For us, Section 5 of the ESA specifically is what directs the Secretary of Agriculture to establish and implement a program to conserve fish, wildlife, and plants, including federally listed species. So that's when we, from the Forest Service perspective, look at the Endangered Species Act. That's one of the first places that we look at in regard to figuring out how to do what we need to do and stay in good standing with that. Section 7A1 is another piece of the Act, and it basically is the affirmative piece for us, and it directs us to utilize our authorities to achieve the intent or purpose of the Endangered Species Act. So we reference it quite a bit in our documents, and it is something that we give consideration and quite a bit of discussion around. ESA Section 7A2 is one that really comes up quite often because it's the consultation piece, and under Section 7A2, we are required to go into interagency Section 7 consultation for any program or project that we determine may affect a listed species or critical habitat. So when we propose something out there in the landscape, whatever it is, from grazing to coal to timber harvest, if we think there's a possibility that there may be a may affect call, then we go into the consultation. So it's a huge piece of what we do in regard to managing for endangered species. So this is kind of a tier down for us because we have the Act, but then of course we're in the Department of Agriculture. So the Department of Ag has the 9500-4 regulation, and as you can see listed on the slide behind me, it kind of is kind of the tier down of here's how you, from the Forest Service perspective, need to work to make sure you're adhering to the Endangered Species Act. Now, I always think this is kind of interesting because look at some of the key words. You have assist in the identification and recovery, avoid actions, evaluate and conserve, consult as necessary, do not approve, fund, or take any action that is likely to jeopardize. Well, that's one of the challenges I think we face from a federal standpoint. Those are all open for interpretation. And as all of you know, and I've worked with probably half of the folks in this room at one time or another on various things, we have a multitude of groups that look at, they interpret it one way and another group interprets it a different way. And so we're in that balancing act of trying to figure it out. But I always think that's interesting, and we want the language to be flexible enough to give us some ability to look at it from a local level, but it also is one of the challenges I think that we have and that we continue to face. So we have under the, so we did the department piece, and we also have the National Forest Management Act, and this is the piece, and we spoke to earlier about the sage grouse, and we're doing plan amendments, and so the National Forest Management Act directs us to provide for diversity of plant and animal communities based on the suitability and capability of specific land area. And if you want to talk about some strong conversations that occur when you start talking about suitability and capability and what that means and how that's interpreted, it can be a pretty robust conversation. But that's our National Forest Management Act that gives us that. So let's take this down a little bit and start talking, or Liz, I will speak to from a Rocky Mountain perspective, what does that mean? And, I don't like to use the word impact because I don't want to, I totally believe that the Endangered Species Act has some really good things behind it, and the intention is great, but I do think it creates some challenges from a manager standpoint, just in the workload. And so a little bit of background. So from 1980 to present, federal threatened endangered species, and we're speaking to the Forest Service here, rose from about 280 to almost 1,600 in the U.S. And Governor Meade, I think, spoke to some different numbers earlier this morning. But, for us, that's kind of the number we're looking at. That's a pretty significant increase. About a third of those species reside on or use national forest and grassland habitats for us, and are potentially affected by management activities. And of course, as a land manager, the number one thing that we actually have control over, because species is not, and I see the 2-minute warning, so I'll speak up. The species is not what we have responsibility for. It is the habitat and how we can maintain that and not have a loss of habitat for the species. Okay, so here's just a couple of examples. You have the Great Plains locust, the yellowfin cutthroat trout, and the Eskimo curlew. And this is what we don't want to happen. These are species that we believe are likely extinct in the Rocky Mountain region, and I think the intent of the ESA is not to have any more of those happen. Now, we have some successes, and I think this is the goal, and you see the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon, and those are just 2 species within our Rocky Mountain region, and of course at a much greater area than just this region. Those are 2 species that have been recovered, have come off of the listing, and are great examples of how this should work when everything goes perfectly. Okay, real quickly, we touched, I think the ferret was brought up, the black-footed ferret. It's a great example for Wyoming. I think it was in 1981 near the TC that they found the ferret, and we thought it was extinct. We had some great success within the U.S. Forest Service. Kanata Basin is a recovery site, and we feel very positive and hopeful that good things are going to be in the future for the ferret and for additional recovery efforts. Just to give you an idea, so the Rocky Mountain region is 5 states. There are 11 national forests. Within just our region, we have 37 listed species, and you can see that's all the forests that we have. Of course, it's Colorado, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas with the grasslands. The pipestain is down in Colorado is the, I won't say winter or loser, but it has the greatest number of species that we have to manage for, and that gives you an idea. A couple of things that have come up recently with that we've seen, and this is an interesting fact. What I was telling somebody who spoke to a couple of folks earlier. So under the multi-district litigation settlement, the Fish and Wildlife Service was mandated to move forward on resolving the status of about 270 candidate species. They've completed about half of those, but just from a Rocky Mountain perspective, since 2010, so that's 5 years, we've had 6 species listed. In the 10 years prior to that, the decade prior to that, we had 1 species that was listed, and that was the Canada lynx. And so, it is increasing in the pace and scale, and that increases the workload for everyone. Whether you're a land manager or an operator on federal lands, that changes the game quite a bit. A couple of noteworthy ESA developments. We've got the lesser prairie chicken, which for us is on the Comanche and Cimarron National Grasslands, and then of course the greater sage grouse. And just a point here, the significant piece about both of these is there's been recognition, high recognition for the involvement of the states. Wyoming, a great example for the sage grouse, greater sage grouse, with the state's plan. But with the lesser prairie chicken, that challenged the decision in the court, which was September 1st, I think, of this year. The judge came back and said that they were vacating the decision from May of 2014 because they believed that the 5-state conservation plan should have been afforded more weight in the decision. And so I think, again, that just showcases, as as with Wyoming and the other states and the greater sage grouse, is that there is a huge role for the states to play in how we go about dealing with this. And then I'm at the end, but this is the challenge for us, and it goes back to that balancing act that I spoke to begin with. Is it as simple as a single species and the mandate to manage for one thing, or should it be the overall balancing act of considering all the things that are on our plate and activities that can occur on national lands? And I think it's the needs of the species can and should be factored into our objectives for these lands, but overall we should be achieving species conservation and meeting the various needs of these multiple use lands by managing for a healthy and resilient landscape. And I think if we do that, then the rest of it should fall in an ideal world into place. Okay. Thank you.
We have time probably for one question. If anybody has a question they'd like to ask of the panel here. If not, I'm going to ask the question. Okay, well, it looks like I'm asking a question. So one question that did come up from the comments of the panel here, that in particular concerns over different management in different states, that there are different ways to manage species in different states. And I guess the question I have is, what can be done to address those and resolve those concerns so that the perspectives and management needs of species in different states can be met?
Well, we were asked that question many times. And I think my colleague, who's head of the Idaho Game and Fish, said it best. Look for results. Are the results positive? Are they working? Who cares what it takes to get it done? He loves to talk about the speed limits. The interstates travel through all of our states. It's one system, but they have different speed limits that are set by each state according to local needs. The result is safety. That's what we're looking for. The result is conservation of the species. That's what we're looking for. If it takes one path to get there in Utah and a different one to get there in California, look at the results. Don't mandate similar standards that may not work. If you impose those standards, as I pointed out in Utah, you're imposing something that isn't going to solve the problem. So let the states put it together, watch the results, and if in 5 years the results are negative, we'll change and do something else. But the current system is just promoting the wrong things.
I think we can all recognize that the concept that one size fits all top-down solution never ever works compared to allowing the states and local governments to work with the people on the ground and develop solutions that reflect the needs of whatever the species happen to be in those particular habitats. And if we can get a change to recognize adaptive management, encourage adaptive management to develop solutions at the ground level, and actually the proof should be in the pudding. I mean, do the management scenarios developed at the local level, if they help enhance the species, then that should be recognized as success. The concept for sage grouse, for example, with the research that was done on, that resulted in the idea that a 7-inch grass height standard in certain cases would help the sage grouse. Now that that's being transformed to an across-the-board solution, west-wide on BLM, it doesn't fit. And we have areas that won't grow 7 inches of high grass, except in very rare years when you have the preset. It just will not happen. And so it's another unreasonable top-down approach.
Yeah, and I'll follow up with what Joel said, because the sage grouse is a great example of the one size does not fit all. And here in Wyoming, the example we have is the Thunder Basin National Grassland. And the capability, the production capability of that grassland is vastly different than, for instance, on the Bridger Teton. And we spent months battling to be able to hold the line to say, you can't hold us, or you have to allow us some flexibility for site capability based on ecological factors for those differences. And yet there was a strong push to say, no, we want a consistent 7 inches everywhere. And that just doesn't make sense. So I think it comes back to, taking it from a reality standpoint of what can actually happen and what can be actually produced out there. And I think the sage grouse gave us some of that, probably not to the total extent it could have, but we did get it to some extent.
Well, thank you again to all of our panelists, and a reminder that if you want to ask any questions, please